This is Focus with Jack Cottle.
Good evening, I'm Jack Cottle. Welcome to this month's edition of Focus. This month we're talking about human trafficking, specifically right here in South Dakota. 4 guests with us to talk about that. Marty Jackley is the Attorney General for the state of South Dakota. Tess Franzen is the Policy Director for Free International. Kevin Colliner, he is an Assistant U.S. Attorney in the state of South Dakota. Jeff Clapper, also an Assistant U.S. Attorney here in South Dakota. Now, human trafficking takes a couple of different forms. We have sex trafficking, also compelled labor. The International Labor Organization estimates that 20 million people, adults and children around the world, live in human slavery. The National Human Trafficking Resource Center has taken 85,000 calls since 2007 and opened almost 20,000 cases. That group says they've taken 259 calls from right here in South Dakota with 21 cases since 2007. We're going to start with you, Marty. I guess, how much human trafficking is actually going on? People don't think about it in little South Dakota.
You know, certainly we're seeing it here in South Dakota. On a national level, it's on the rise, and it exists here in South Dakota. We started seeing human trafficking cases as early as 2006. It's been a problem, but we're addressing it. We're doing it through operations and through really aggressive prosecutions of those that are harming children through either labor trafficking or sex trafficking.
So what kind of things are we seeing most here?
We've only seen one labor trafficking case that came out of the Oklahoma area. Most of what we're seeing here would be the sex trafficking, really the trafficking, which is the force, the threats, the coercion of young people to engage in inappropriate sexual activities.
Now, Tess, you're with Free International. What does your group do, and what do you guys see when it comes to human trafficking out here in South Dakota?
Free International is based in Las Vegas. I work here in western South Dakota. What we see here are victims, some of them my age, that will come forward to us and say, yeah, I was trafficked when I was a teenager throughout the region, and we know what happens, but of course we don't know how often. My role is largely to build a bridge of trust between a victim and a law enforcement member that can help them, to help guide them onto a pathway of a healthier future, to connect them with the counselor, to connect them with lodging if necessary, or whatever their needs may be at the time.
How much of that are you seeing here in the state?
Some, not a lot.
Okay. Kevin Colliner, Assistant U.S. Attorney here in the state of South Dakota. At a federal level, what kind of cases are you guys seeing coming through, and how much of that is there these days?
Well, you know, South Dakota has been a leader, I'm proud to say in some ways. I'm also a citizen of this state, so it's worrisome in other ways. We've been a leader in prosecuting these cases federally. We've had 3 different men sentenced to life prison terms in the federal system with larger scale sex trafficking cases involving what's classically called a pimp and various victims. We've had a number of those cases. We've also been a leader nationally in using the federal sex trafficking statutes to go after the demand side, the customer side of human trafficking. So we have seen a fair amount for a state of our size on the federal side of this case.
Are we seeing the same kind of things here that they see in other parts of the country, or is it different here in South Dakota?
I think sex trafficking takes the same face nationwide. We're just seeing it here in South Dakota, and in the Midwest we wouldn't expect big urban type crimes to be here locally, but unfortunately we are.
So who are the victims? Who are the victims that we're finding here in this state?
The victims are women and children. We've seen them from ages 14 up to 40, and they come from many walks of life, but the key ingredient they have, or commonality between them all, is they're all vulnerable. They might have addictions, they might have homelessness, they might have various backgrounds that just make them susceptible to people taking advantage of them and exploiting them.
Now, are these people from South Dakota? Are they people that are brought into South Dakota to do this kind of stuff? Where are they coming from?
You know, most of our victims in the federal cases have been from South Dakota or surrounding states. We have had a few victims from outside South Dakota. Another common factor we see in a lot of the victims in our cases is extreme poverty. You know, South Dakota, we have 5 of the 10 poorest counties in the United States, and it's not a coincidence that many of our victims have come from those communities. Many have been enrolled members from reservation communities within South Dakota, some of the poorest places in the United States. So that's another aspect of what we see in South Dakota and the vulnerabilities that we see in our victims.
Now, Tess, you work with victims, try to bring them out of this. Is there a common thread that you see in victims that you're finding here in this area?
Every one of the survivors and victims I've spoken to have reported that they were sexually abused as children. And I think that's one of the things that creates a vulnerability as they get a little bit older to being lured or coerced into a trafficking situation. Some of them have drug addictions or alcohol addictions that become drug addictions. And most of them come from families where they don't have two parents involved with them as they're growing up.
How do they get brought into this? How do they get from those situations and get dragged into this?
We all have needs. We have needs to be loved and accepted. We have needs for security and shelter. And if those needs aren't met in their home in a safe way, it creates a hole that they may be vulnerable to having that exploited by someone who knows how to manipulate those vulnerabilities.
Now, Marty, on the state legal level, what have you seen as far as victims go? What common threads do they have?
You know, oftentimes we'll see victims that maybe come from a situation where there's an absent father, that somebody will then try to take advantage of them through a grooming process, either through gifts or trying to become that father figure. We've seen other victims that, you know, to be frank, are in a situation where they maybe don't have anybody to turn to. They don't have a mother that's keeping an eye on them. And that's why I think it's so important that some of the groups, whether it be Free International, Free the Black Hills, can add so much to this discussion and be a very large part of the solution to make sure that folks know that there is a place to turn.
What about an age range? What is the age range of people that you're dealing with that are victims of human trafficking?
Like I said, anywhere from 14 to 40 are some of the ages of the victims that we've encountered in South Dakota. Sadly, there are a number of children under the age of 18 that have been caught up in this horrible crime. And the problem that they face is they're young and they feel unable to go to anybody to help them. And so they are forced into this through fraud, through force, through getting beat, and they're caught up in it and don't know how to get out.
Now, is this strictly girls, or do we have boys, men?
You know, in the labor trafficking case that Marty touched on a little bit, there were some men involved, different type of crime, but under the same kind of umbrella. We haven't had any cases involving boys or young men in South Dakota, but that doesn't mean they haven't happened. Nationwide, there are certainly cases that have involved boys and young men, and so we're on the lookout for those as well.
Now, one of the things I've talked to people seem kind of confused about human trafficking, strictly kidnapping people, bringing them somewhere else. From the federal legal standpoint, what is human trafficking? How is that defined?
You know, human trafficking is defined as compelling someone to do some kind of work or services, whether it be sex or labor, in a way that a person, you know, overcomes their will. If it's a minor involved and it's sex trafficking, the definition doesn't require that we prove any coercion. In other words, coercion is in some ways implied when it's a minor. So if you cause a minor to engage in a commercial sex activity, you may be guilty of a federal crime. The term trafficking in some ways is a misnomer. You mentioned kidnapping, taking them somewhere. Human trafficking doesn't require movement. So there's no requirement in the federal code that a person be brought across state lines, for instance. There is a federal commerce part of it, but it only requires using things that are affecting interstate commerce. And not to get too much in the legal weeds, but if you use a cell phone, if you use the internet, if you drive on a highway, if you use products that travel across state lines, you can be guilty of a federal crime. So trafficking is a misnomer in the sense that these crimes don't require movement. One of the cases we've prosecuted in the last year, U.S. v. Muhammad al-Aboudi, a man who got 4 life terms, he did most of his operation from his apartment. Pretty much sat at home, and homeless girls and young women came to him, and his customers came there too. So that's an important thing for your viewers to keep in mind. We're not talking about these international incidents or even cases that necessarily cross state borders.
All right, talking about life sentences, we'll look at some of the penalties that are involved in these cases when we come back with this month's edition of Focus. I'm Jack Cottle. Welcome back to this month's edition of Focus, talking about human trafficking here in South Dakota. Kevin Collier is an assistant U.S. attorney with South Dakota. You talked about a gentleman getting a life sentence. What are the penalties, and just how hard can you come down on people when they're convicted of this stuff?
You know, under the federal statute, there's a number of statutes that may be involved here. ranging from, say, child pornography all the way to the federal sex trafficking statute. The penalties range from 15 years mandatory minimum to life in prison for sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. So, in other words, you can't go to prison for any less than 15 years, and up to life in prison if you're convicted under that statute. Now, if it's a minor and there's no force, fraud, or coercion involved, there's still a mandatory minimum, 10 years, up to life in prison. There's no parole in the federal system, too, so that's another thing to be considered when you talk about the terms of years. We have had a number of these individuals who've been sentenced to life terms in the federal system.
Jeff Clapper is also an assistant U.S. attorney in South Dakota. Is the Department of Justice making a concerted effort to come down hard on the people that are doing this?
Absolutely. I think nationwide the Department of Justice has really tried to go after these types of crimes and make sure they're punished as harshly as possible.
Now, Marty Jackley is the Attorney General from the state of South Dakota. Different laws, state level is federal level. What are the laws here in South Dakota? What tools do you guys have to go after?
You know, the legislature has been very good to prosecutors in South Dakota. We really have the range of 0 to life depending upon what the conduct is. Solicitation of a minor, typically 0 to 10. When you get into the kidnapping or when there's more acts involved, it's 0 to life. And so we have the tools to really prosecute a broad range of conduct. And the legislature recently has also put human trafficking on the sex offender registry and also put in human trafficking forfeiture laws so that all the profits as well as the assets and other things used to human traffic are all turned over to the state and ultimately go either to law enforcement or the victims.
Now, the Polaris Project ranked South Dakota as one of the worst states in the country as far as having laws to fight human trafficking. Is the state keeping up with that fight?
The state is. Part of what had gone on with the Polaris Project is if you look overall at South Dakota's laws, we have a kidnapping statute in place that is 0 to life, and so that wasn't taken into account. Prosecutors have the ability to protect victims by giving prosecutorial immunity. So some of the specific things that project was looking at are already in place in our laws. And recently we have done some legislative action. We put forfeiture in place in our statutes. We put it on the sex offender registry. So I think we do much better, and certainly there's always room for improvement, but the legislature has stepped up and given prosecutors more tools to address human trafficking.
Now, Tess, you work again with victims with Free International. As you look at the laws federally and in South Dakota, are they enough? Do they do the job to protect victims and to get them out of the situations that they're in?
The federal Congress just passed and the president signed a law that provides more resources for those who fight, who want to end human trafficking. At the state level, I've been working with the Attorney General and with legislators the last couple of sessions to try to fine-tune the state laws so that we can fill in some areas that might be strengthened, and hopefully this next session we can have some more discussions on what might be able to occur.
What would you like to see strengthened in that?
I would like to see, instead of strengthening, I'd like to see some clarification. Right now we have lawmakers in place that are very conscientious that, like what the Attorney General said, where there is an avenue for immunity and where there are resources, those are largely judgment calls by people who are thoughtful. I would like to see some of those things clarified in statute so that if down the road we have different people in those positions, there won't be any ambiguity, but there would automatically be that immunity there.
Now, here in South Dakota, people not thinking a lot about human trafficking, I don't think. What do you look for? How do you spot something like that? How do you spot somebody that's involved in this or a victim of this?
Well, there are people that we walk past every day, and even those of us who are familiar with the signs will probably miss it more often than not, because someone who has a serious drug challenge might be trafficked, or they might be someone with a serious drug challenge. It may not look different. Trafficking victims, they will often have a hard time meeting you eye to eye. Their stories don't always line up. There are gaps, or their stories are obviously made up on the fly, or someone is controlling them. If a young person is brought into an urgent care or a clinic and an older male has brought them in and he's answering the questions for this young woman, that's a sign that this might not be a healthy thing, and it would be appropriate to separate them and be able to visit with the younger woman without the other person there. So just things that would indicate they're not in control.
From what you guys have seen in prosecuting these cases, are there warning signs that people should see? Are there warning signs that people should look for?
I think when we've looked at cases and we've seen the history of them, we've seen there's been a history of victims that have gone to the hospital and the person controlling them would never let them out of their sight. We've seen other cases where the police have been called to their residence a number of times on domestic violence calls, and then the victim doesn't follow through and go to court. And there's been other times where after someone's been arrested, neighbors come forward and they say, yeah, that's the place where there was all kinds of fighting and loud things going on and lots of people coming in and out of the place. So those are the kinds of signs that people should look for. They may have a victim of sex trafficking or human trafficking right there in their midst.
So what keeps these people from just walking away?
Well, a number of things. When we talk about, say, labor trafficking cases, oftentimes these people have, say, large debt obligations hanging over their heads. That was the case in the U.S. v. Farrell case in Oklahoma. There were folks from another country being kept in what's called peonage-like conditions in the Chamberlain area. So they had large debt obligations, language difficulties, things of that nature. The threats and the violence that we've seen in the sex trafficking case are often very severe. So you have victims who are literally scared for their lives to leave or to come forward. You have all sorts of subtle forms of threats. For instance, in one case we prosecuted, one of the main tactics of the trafficker was to take nude photographs of his young victims before he ever started to actually traffic them into commercial sex. And then when they wanted to leave, he would threaten that he was going to share those nude photos with their friends and their family members. That is a form of psychological coercion that's very effective when dealing with, say, a 15, 16-year-old girl who's embarrassed about things that she may have been complicit with initially. So we see a lot of that kind of subtle manipulation that turns into a very coercive situation down the road. Lots of threats, lots of violence in some of these cases.
All right, what are some of the myths and misconceptions about human trafficking? We'll take a look at that when we come back with this month's edition of Focus. I'm Jack Cottle. Welcome back to this month's edition of Focus, talking about human trafficking here in South Dakota. Tess Franzen is the policy director for Free International, talking a second ago about some of the reasons why victims don't just walk away. You said you had some additional reasons that why they may stay.
Well, as Kevin said, they are afraid of their traffickers in almost every situation. It's a dangerous situation, and the trafficker obviously doesn't want them to leave. They don't want them to talk to law enforcement. But at the same time, the victims are typically afraid of law enforcement. They know that what they're engaged in is illegal, whether it's the drug activity or whether it is sexual prostitution, and they don't want to be arrested. They're afraid that if they have minor children, those children may be taken by the state. So not only are they afraid of their traffickers, they're afraid of the people that can help them, which is why it's important to build a bridge. In South Dakota, we have outstanding people that are prosecutors and law enforcement, and they understand the victims, and they are not out to go after the victims. They really want the bad guys.
Marty, as from the law enforcement side, how do you guys bridge that gap between the victims and who may be committing a crime and the traffickers?
Certainly part of what we do in law enforcement is rely upon Free International, Free the Black Hills. We rely on those organizations to hopefully, convince victims that it's the right thing to do to maybe protect other victims. Once of victims with law enforcement, we certainly have the ability to give prosecution immunity. We have, certain levels of ability to help them. And we do just that. I think that there's also going to be some further victim rights discussions in South Dakota. As Attorney General, I'm writing a ballot explanation right now for a constitutional amendment on victims' rights. It'll be out within the next couple weeks. So the voters of South Dakota are going to have an opportunity to weigh in on what do we need to do in South Dakota to protect those victims. All
right, Jeff Clapper is Assistant U.S. Attorney here in South Dakota. Are there misconceptions, or are there myths, or the things people don't understand about human trafficking that they should?
I think one thing I've learned in the years that I've been involved in this is all of the girls and women involved in this. You would think when law enforcement shows up and they say, hey, we're here to help, we're here to rescue you, they don't immediately identify with that situation. They don't want to get out of it right away because that's a coping mechanism that they've had. They've lived in that coercive environment for such a long period of time that, as Tess was saying, they don't recognize how helpful the police can be. So it takes a period of time to gain their trust and to help them realize that they actually can get out of that horrible situation they're in.
Kevin Colliner is also an assistant U.S. attorney here in South Dakota. Are there misconceptions that you see?
Well, we've hit on one here. This is not a crime where victims raise their hand and want our help, at least initially. And it's embarrassing. I mean, that's a big piece of this, right? It's embarrassing to come forward as a young woman and talk about the things that have happened to you. And so a paradigm shift that I think has happened in law enforcement in South Dakota in my time doing these cases is we talk about a victim-centered approach. And what we mean by that is that when law enforcement encounters a young woman who's involved in prostitution, we try to view her as a victim, a potential victim first. Just determine whether there's needs that she might have that we need to address before we can address her full story. It's true, it is a crime on the state level, prostitution, but we've come to realize that there's a much more serious crime here that may be lurking in the background. And as law enforcement, we have to prioritize criminal activity at times, go after the bad guys truly involved in these cases. So that's one big myth, that you'll have victims lined up to come forward. We talked about the myth about movement. There's not a requirement of movement in these cases. And so, you know, those are two of the big myths that I've heard that I think are untrue.
Now, Marty, from state level, anything that you see that people don't understand about this?
You know, I think, again, Kevin hit on it. It goes right back to the victims that, you know, oftentimes there's that hesitancy to come back. Another thing I think it's important to point on is the importance of the cooperative efforts between the federal authorities, the state authorities, and local law enforcement, how well we work together. I mean, each of these cases, whether it be the Oklahoma case that really was a local law enforcement, then a state, then a federal, the Boshi case, all of those cases oftentimes that involves victims witness people working with the victim, and it may be a federal victims witness person and a state victims witness. We dedicate that effort to the victims. We'll try to make enforcement decisions on what the best penalty is. Sometimes because of the state penalties, it makes more sense that we bring a solicitation case, a kind of a lower level crime. In some of the more serious cases where the federal authorities have mandatory minimums, they have those life sentences, that makes better sense. And we do a very good job in South Dakota working together to try to place these cases where they need to be.
And Tess, as far as victims go, what's available to them if they're looking for help, if they want to reach out?
They can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline number anywhere in the country, and that's 888-3737-888. Locally, you can call local law enforcement, you can call 911, but as far as resources, there's a limit to the resources that we have, and that's one of the challenges that we have as we start to address human trafficking more. One of the reasons victims don't leave trafficking is because they don't have better options. So we've been working on laying the groundwork to provide better options, a place where they can get counseling, someone to make sure that if they need to get in to see social services for state assistance for something, they can get that. But we have a lot of work to do on that level.
All right, we are at a time. I want to thank all of you for coming up. Tess Franzen, Marty Jackley, Kevin Colliner, and Jeff Clapper. Again, good luck and good work on the fight against human trafficking. That will do it for us for this month's edition of Focus. Hope to see you again right here the first Sunday night of next month. Good night.